Hi, this is Ron Velin. Welcome to this video tutorial on the ladder of inference. The ladder of inference is a significant and useful tool, and it was created by Chris Argyris in the United States close to 30 years ago. And the main purpose of the ladder of inference is to give us an opportunity to break down our responses, our actions in given situations, and uncover in situations where we weren't so thrilled with how we responded, and find out ways to make changes that will help promote more easeful, more effective actions in situations that might be difficult for us. Now, of course, you can use this tool for any situation, maybe a circumstance that you are happy about, to understand what was going on for you there, what your thought process was for it. Generally, though, we try to use this to make improvements, to look at how we can be more effective in situations, that might push our buttons, where people get on our nerves, or we're stressed and frustrated, or things like that, that we feel that we might be losing control or losing our sense of centeredness and respond in ways that cause future harm. The ladder of inference has 7 key steps to it, and it also has another element that we're going to talk about in a few minutes called the reflexive loop, and this is very, very important. But let's begin by understanding what the 7 elements or steps are. When we respond to something, we are going from observing the situation in front of us, diving into what provokes us, tapping into our psychology around it, and responding accordingly. What Chris Argyris says is, look, let's have a look at it, let's break it down and what those different levels are, and see where we have opportunities to make changes that allow us to be more effective. So the first step is we observe data and experiences. This is step 1, and basically what's going on here, it's kind of like having a video recorder in any situation. There's no judgment, there's no other influence going on. This doesn't last very long. This is kind of looking at it initially. What we do in our mind's eye, though, is we select data. This is the second step. We narrow in on things that pull our attention. Now, for every person, it's going to be a little bit different. For example, when you have witnesses to a car accident or something like that, typically more than one person is interviewed, if that's possible, because everyone has a slightly different point of view, or maybe a dramatically different point of view of what took place. Even if we're all witnessing the same thing, we do see it differently, and part of that is because we have our own internal filters, our own internal lenses that will skew our point of view, our perspective, and therefore unconsciously we'll narrow in on something that pulls our attention. So that's important. We select data. The third thing that we do is we add a meaning to that data. In other words, we narrow in on something, we say, this is catching my attention. Very quickly our mind says, this is what this means. Based on that meaning that we come up with, we start to make assumptions. And again, don't forget, this is happening very, very quickly, lightning speed. We can make an assumption based on the meaning that you've added to this. And don't forget, the meaning is completely subjective, and you may have no idea what's going on, or what the motivations are behind the people acting or going on, or what is happening in that situation. We draw a conclusion after we make a few assumptions. It's sort of a therefore, this must be what this is all about. And ultimately, we integrate this or create a belief around it based on our psychological makeup and experiences. Now, we may already have that belief in place. That's often the case that happens. If we don't see a situation as being something directly similar to something we've had before, we will look to bridge it to a belief that we have about something else, just because that's the way the mind does. It looks for associations between things we see. And then ultimately, the last step is we take an action. Now, all of this happens very, very quickly. Milliseconds, often. Sometimes it takes longer. We'll get a chance to stew on it. But often it happens so quickly. And what we need to do is tap into different steps here. And there are particular ones we can look at to help break a cycle. Because here's what happens. Once we have an experience of something, or something that's similar to something we experience, we tap into something called the reflexive loop. So here's what happens when we tap into the reflexive loop. The reason we're selecting data is because we have a belief system or a belief map that of course is born out of our core values. What happens is this belief map is like an obstacle course almost that guides our focus and our thinking to confirm these beliefs, because we are essentially married to our belief system until something changes it. But what happens when we witness something is we look to file it or align it with a belief system to help us with our understanding of it. And so we know how to act in any given situation. So the reflexive loop basically is saying, I have this belief from previous experience, and it's going to inform the data I select in that circumstance. And this will ultimately reinforce our belief we have about that situation. And it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways in terms of our own awareness and how we respond. And the key with all of this is, can I interrupt the reflexive loop so that I can act more effectively and perhaps just simply be more content about a circumstance that's causing me to respond in a way that I'm not so thrilled about? So without making this more complicated, let's take a look at an example. So here we are with an example. It could be anything from the workplace. We'll keep it professionally contexted, but let's have a look at something. So let's say I'm an employer and one of my employees is a woman named Priya. It could be anybody. I've just taken a name out of a hat. Priya reports to me, and let's say I'm responsible for some significantly large projects, and Priya's been a contributor to at least one of our project teams. The first observable data and experience I'm noticing is Priya misses a key deadline for one of the project assignments. She gives no apology or explanation, has missed the two most recent meetings, and has not replied to team emails. This is something that at this point would be data that anybody could observe or note. It's not colored by our judgment. We haven't assigned anything to it, but we notice that these things have occurred. Now, because of my psychological makeup, I might select or focus in on some things that I'm starting to see and possibly things that bug me. When this happens, I start to color the data as I select it. Here I'm saying that Priya deliberately missed the meetings to avoid any accountability. She did not speak to me about the missed deadline or demonstrate any consideration of the impact of her actions. Now we have a bit of a question mark here, which is what's going on that I'm coming to this tilted view of the selected data that I have. Very quickly in a circumstance like this, I start to add meaning to it. I start to say, well, Priya is avoiding her responsibility and is not willing to take ownership for the missed deadline or her lack of communication with me. Now, of course, I don't know this, but this is the meaning I'm adding to it. Because I have my own experiences and I'm seeing the world in a certain way, when I notice certain behavior, I will start to move toward this meaning, whereas maybe somebody else might not have that association at all and might see it completely differently. In Chris Argyris's model, we move to the next stage, which is I make assumptions based on the meanings I added. So now the assumptions that I come to that are based on the meaning I've added to this are that Priya is not interested in taking on additional tasks and has pulled away from the team. She might be looking for another job. Now, maybe in my work life, I've had that experience when someone's sort of missing deadlines or not following through the way they might have normally. I'm thinking, oh, they must be looking for a job. Again, this can take a million different directions, but this is just an example of how this works. Once we unearth assumptions, I draw a conclusion or conclusions. And here I'm saying that Priya cannot be trusted to follow through on responsibilities assigned to her. She probably doesn't like working here and wants to leave. So these are the conclusions I've come to based on everything that I've thought about so far. And again, this could be happening in milliseconds. Even if I think about it for hours, because I worked with Priya and I haven't talked to her in a little bit, but maybe I've thought about this all day. But what happens when we think about things, often we tap into the reflexive loop and we actually cycle through the event over and over and over again in our memory. And sometimes that causes an even deeper connection and a deeper reflexive loop that's even harder to break through until somebody brings us something that changes our pattern. This feeds into my belief system and the belief I adopt about the world here. And about the world, by the way, it doesn't mean the entire planet, but often it's the world around the experience. So we see, I can't trust Priya. She's not loyal and is likely going to leave. I must not give her any additional responsibilities in the future. Of course, we can all see the problems with this. It could be a totally different direction, but this is not the most constructive way to look at things. But this is what I've chosen unconsciously to follow through on. And then it's reflected in the action that I take, which is I don't trust Priya, so that seems to be point final there. I am curt and abrupt with her when we speak, so when I do eventually bump into her, that's how I respond. And I don't include her in future projects, so I alienate her, which is probably going to encourage her to leave if she wasn't thinking of leaving already. So that's what's going on with this example. So what does the ladder do? It allows us to break this down, put everything into kind of slow motion when we reflect on it, and see where can I make changes, especially if I'm not happy with the way I acted. If I'm looking at this going, boy, I didn't really handle this well. I think that it would have been better for me to be calm and sit down to talk to her more, maybe find out what's bothering her. At some part of this, if I could make a little bit of a shift, it might allow me to develop a different kind of reflexive loop that allows me to behave more, perhaps professionally, more compassionately. So if I take away these circumstances here, if I just erase these arrows, and we go back and look, we can think, where would it be possible to make a change? You know, if I was going to interrupt the reflexive loop that's causing me to respond in this way, and in fact is reinforcing it as I think about it more and more, maybe there's a way for me to look at things differently. And I always look at it like this. It's easy to say, well, I just need a different belief. But you can't just believe something differently, because the beliefs are linked to deep-rooted values, and either they are reflective of the positive, constructive nature of that value, or they reflect in a negative way what happens when our value is violated. What we want to look at then is, if that's the belief we have, perhaps it can be easier if we take a couple of steps down and say, what possible difference could I make that would be a much easier shift that might shift my awareness at a higher level? So I always encourage people to look, first of all, what is the meaning you're adding? And ask simply this, is this true 100%, or is it a possibility that I'm wrong? Well, of course, there's always the possibility I'm wrong. And so that's one step I encourage people. Are you sure? Since the meaning we add has so much cultural context and personal experience context, is it possible that when I look at the meaning I've added here, that Priya is avoiding her responsibility and is not willing to take ownership for the missed deadline or a lack of communication with me? What if I just shifted this meaning that Priya is avoiding her responsibility? Maybe there's a personal crisis. Maybe she's afraid to come to me because she'll feel she'll disappoint me. Maybe her own standards are so high that her own negative self-talk is just beating her up so much she couldn't even stand to get more feedback. I've certainly had that experience myself, and I know many people that have as well. There are a lot of different things that could be going on. Maybe the meaning I could add here is that Priya may be afraid of coming to me with this circumstance that's causing her to miss deadlines. And maybe that's going to make this pattern different. And so when something like this happens, instead of going from step 2 all the way up to step 6, thereby reinforcing the reflexive loop, I interrupt it, and maybe then my assumptions start to change. The conclusions I draw start to change, and maybe my belief is going to be different. And the action I might take is, maybe it's going to be speak to Priya. And I'll even go so far to say speak to Priya compassionately. Wouldn't that be different? Now, it may still be the same result. Maybe I'll find out she is looking for another job and she just doesn't care. That's fine. But at least I haven't overreacted. So this gives you an example of what it can be and how it can be used. And it can be a hugely valuable tool for anybody who's in a leadership role, leading change, even if you're not in an official leadership role. But if you're responding to things or someone's getting under your skin, as we say, you know, someone's pushing your buttons, you always say if someone's doing that, well, it's your buttons that are being pushed. In other words, it's your psychology that's being worked over. So this will help you break down some of these things. And this is actually great fodder for future work. If you find yourself constantly adding meaning that seems very negative, that can be great for your own growth and development if you explore that with a therapist or a coach or something that allows you to understand that a little bit more and gradually disentangle it so it doesn't have as much power over you. So this is just one example. I'm a big fan of the ladder of inference. It's been around for a long time and it's used a lot, and the reason is probably because it's such a great tool. So play with this model a little bit. Try the ladder of inference in different circumstances. Start by looking at a circumstance where you didn't act in a way you thought was great. And you can actually start to work backwards. So let's just erase our notes here. And so we start to look at this, we can say, okay, you're in a situation, start with the action you took. Then you can work backwards. So let's say you yelled at somebody after a meeting, or you didn't return somebody's call, or you find yourself engaging in passive-aggressive behavior, which is not good for anybody. You can start there and say, what was my belief? What do I believe about the situation that triggered me? And you can actually work your way down to untangle things like this. Another thing you can do is go as far as your belief and then go to, well, what was that circumstance? And what was I really focusing on? And so you don't have to do this all in a linear way. You can do it in steps and back and forth all over the place. But once you get to a circumstance, you might want to map through what would have been more ideal and start with the observed data and experiences. Then go to the select data. What if you had focused on something else? And that'll, of course, bring back to your belief, and you're going to go back and forth. So have some fun with it. It's meant to be a tool to play with and work with, and you may find you get a lot out of it. If you have any questions, you can reach me at ron@primarypathways.com.